Welcome to the second part of this heritage talk on uncovering Park Street.
Now, this next image that we can hopefully show, it's taken from a really important work of anatomy by a man called Andreas Vesalius. His book on anatomy and engravings from the 16th century is kind of monumental in our understanding of how the human body works. And what I think is really important about this image is the kind of clambering further of those early anatomists in their pursuit of what lies beneath the skin. Now, despite it being the 19th century, that curiosity and clambering further hasn't abated, probably only got worse. So Birmingham actually had its own anatomist, this brilliant man called William Sands Cox. My colleague Don will be discussing more on him later. And historic records indicate that William Sands Cox opened a medical school in nearby Temple Row in 1825. Remember, the cemetery is open from 1810, and then founded Queen's Hospital in Bath Row in 1841. So as we'll go on to see, the rather posthumous residents of Park Street were perhaps fated to be used in the pursuit of medical knowledge. So within the archaeologically recorded burials that we've excavated through Park Street, 45 skeletons demonstrated signs of dissection and autopsy, with 43 of these recovered from the north area. So that's approximately 60% of skeletons exhibited either active or healed pathology and/or trauma. So this beautiful image that we've drawn up specifically for this webinar today is actually of Park Street. So we have a north-south divide. Perhaps if you can have a look at the details, we can see which side is the north and the south. So in the background, we'll start off with that. We've got some houses and factories. That plume of smoke that you can see cutting through the background is one of the trains from the London Western Railway. There's lots of monuments in the back there as well, so perhaps these people are richer. The gates certainly look finer, and we have towards the gates in the mid-ground, we have a rather sort of Victorian-looking lady, looking very sad in her full mourning habit, watching the burial of potentially a loved one. Well, what I'd really like to bring your eyes to is the shape of the coffin. So one of the more beautiful things, I think, from a grim and archaeological perspective, is the coffin shapes they found at Park Street. One of them was this incredible fishtail shape. It looks quite arts and crafty, so it may lead more towards trends and ideas and what sort of fashions, really, of what coffins could look like. But also there's potentially the idea to stop body snatchers pulling out the body from either end. I think if it's a fishtail shape, you've got a pinch point. So you might just get the feet or you might just get the head. You're probably unlikely to get the whole cadaver itself. Now, in the foreground, things are a little bit more nefarious. We've got some hoodlums leaning up against the broken entranceway to Park Street. What's really interesting is that some of the historical records we have for Park Street talk about sloggers, and these are the early gangs. And we do know that Birmingham perhaps has the most famous gangs with the Peaky Blinders. So these sloggers were the precursor to the Peaky Blinders. But so far they've just got bottles in their hands, not shivs in their hats. And I also want to draw your attention to the rather sad affair of the kind of no nonsense, no fuss in burial that's happening here. If you see the burial, the coffin itself, it's very, very plain, it's wooden, and there's a very, very plain headstone. So what we're suggesting through this image is that anatomists like William Sands Cox, once they were finished with the body, they were burying them within the grounds of the burial ground itself. And Don will actually go into a bit more detail. And the last thing I'd like to point your eye to, which is my favourite bit in this image, is their sort of sad and slightly ravaged mourner. And the implication here is that she may have syphilis, so she may have a rather nefarious nighttime job, entertaining the people of Temple Row, and perhaps she's had to pay for the cost of the funeral by donating a loved one's body to anatomy into science.
And how can you tell she might have had syphilis, Emma?
So syphilis is grim, and the final stages, so tertiary syphilis, as I can show you in later slides, actually starts to affect the bones. So if you watch the film The Libertine with Johnny Depp, he says, "You will not like me" at the start, and his nose eventually falls off at the end of the film. It's because syphilis is just riddled and getting into his bones and slowly eating away at his body. So it's very unpleasant.
Okay. Maybe we can see it in the jawline. Ah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's starting. So she's got tertiary syphilis there, and it's starting to eat away at that kind of those more fleshy bits, and you would be able to tell that that's the disease that she had, and she'd probably be judged quite harshly for that in Victorian society. It's a very sad time.
yeah. I like to think that these people here are waiting as well. They're looking at the body and thinking we'll come back later tonight.
Yeah, it is a possibility, isn't it? Now we also have it. We attach hopefully a time lapse. Is that right? Lovely. So we can still see the results of the Park Street excavations themselves. What we're looking at now is the northern area. So the excavations revealed that both sides of the site, so the north and the south, were distinct in terms of their stratigraphy, so that's the different layers, and the archaeology. Generally, both areas, the north and south, demonstrated pre-burial ground archaeology, 19th century burials, and numerous layers of overburden. So we started to see kind of a bit like a human trifle, the different layers of people stacking up through time. However, the north area demonstrated several layers of made ground holding multiple phases of burial, whilst all burials in the south were cut directly into the natural geology. I've got a slide later that will show you how heavily they're stacked. But we really are seeing how the bodies are just stacked one on top of each other in the north, whereas in the south, we see in this image here, it's far more ordered. So all those circles, as you probably guessed by now, are the graves and the burials. And in this one, we can start to see the family crypts, more evident of those monuments from the south area. So the family crypts, if you just look for the little squares there, so they're basically brick vaults. We can show one a bit later. So the north area, as I said, is relatively disorganized burial ground layout, and there was occasional intercutting of burials alongside just a single brick tomb, whereas the south area had a well-organized burial ground layout with very distinctive grave cuts and little intercutting of burials, alongside multiple and varied brick burial structures. So both sides of the park also have been subject to landscaping in the past, with each half demonstrating considerable overburdening, so extra soil going on top of it. So to summarise, the north is poor, has haphazard graves, and one funerary structure, and lots of signs of medical experimentation and dissection, whereas the south is better off, it's well ordered, and has larger funerary structures that denote wealth. So this, I think, is a collection of images. And Tash, you were asking about syphilis. So, so this middle, if you look here in the middle, we have the skull. It's a female skull with tertiary syphilis. And if you don't know if you can sort of pick out the way her cheekbones and her jaw, and she certainly doesn't have any teethless, it's almost like sort of the syphilis has kind of smoothed down those bones and eroded it away. We also have the brick tomb on the left. Now, this brick tomb was actually found in the northern area, so that's quite interesting. So the northern areas has been more poor, but there's still a brick tomb. And one of the things that I find is kind of a very, very soft and kind of tangible element of how the Victorians viewed death is this lace pillowcase that was found in one of the burials, in one of the coffins. So there's an element of kind of like mourning culture, memento mori in the 19th century, and the place is quite nice. There's a level of reverence and care for their dear departed by this quite ornate lace pillowcase. And from an archaeological point of view, it's very exciting that they can find materials like this still intact. So we were saying how the dead are basically living on top of each other. Things are pretty stacked in this image. So we can see that there are two phases of the burial grounds, I believe it's in the north. So we can see that they're burying coffins one on top of the other, which does suggest that multiple people have been buried in any one day. And to get a glimpse of what that actually looks like on the ground, so the image here on the right, it's not a man with very, very long legs or a skeleton with very long legs. It's actually, in fact, two graves. And we can see there the earlier grave on the bottom, we just have kind of from his thighs down to his toes. And then the later one, so the later one's higher up, and we can see their full body there. So there's just inches of soil between the two of them, which really shows that kind of the shambles of day-to-day life, where you're living back to back, one on top of the other, like in that room full of cholera. Even in death, you don't escape it. There's always no space.
Thank you for watching part 2 of this heritage talk on uncovering Park Street.